to another episode of the Pop Occulture Show. Pop Occulture with Lilith Dorsey and Jason Winslade. She's Lilith, I'm Jason, and we are back and ready to talk about our next property that is occulty or occult adjacent. I'm wearing something that's somewhat appropriate. It's my varsity sweater, since I decided to go for this thing is actually it's pretty good shape from the late 80s, about 8 years earlier than this show is set. But we are talking about Yellowjackets today. Yellowjackets, the phenomenon that's on Showtime. But we are talking about what we've seen so far, which is only the first two seasons. So we haven't watched the third season yet. So don't worry, there won't be any spoilers for the new season. I'm going to try to not do too many spoilers at all, although there will be some things that I'm sure will be revealed, but tend to want to be more about the themes rather than like specific things that get spoiled. So yeah, we're doing Yellowjackets, and this was your suggestion. Tell us what grabbed you about this show, and then we'll get into it.
I mean, it was my suggestion. I love Yellowjackets, even though people won't necessarily think of it as an occult property per se. I think there are a lot of themes. You know, I was mentioning to you before we started that we have a weird sort of thematic thing going on, even though we're going back and forth. You know, last time we did Mayfair Witches, we did Apartment 7 and Rosemary's Baby. So we've got these like city properties, but there's a way in which I can see the connections because it has to do with us and them. It has to do with othering. It has to do with hidden things in our own personality and those that we think we know, right? Do we know ourselves? Do we know those around us that are very close? So I think that's something that I really wanted to highlight on this show. I also think the acting is phenomenal. I totally stand Christina Ricci. I'm not going to camp outside her house, but I adore everything that she does. There's such phenomenal acting in this. You know, everybody really gets to shine. And I think that they do a lovely job of going back and forth between, you know, modern day and when these girls, literally girls, were lost in the woods. So that's something that's fascinating to me. And I love the cinematography. I love the costumes. I think it was 2 years ago, my Mardi Gras costume was Doom's Coming. So, and only a couple of people got it. I had my Doom's Coming costume on with my, you know, Doom's Coming sash and my horn and antlers crown and everything like that. And there's a way in which it really spoke to me as somebody who was sort of alienated in high school, right? I think so many of us can appreciate that kind of story, you know, having friends that turn on us, having friends that lie to us, this kind of feral teenagerhood that so many of us from Gen X sort of experienced. And this show does a lovely way of encapsulating that and also bringing in the supernatural, the mysticism, the shamanic currents, the insanity of it all. So it's something I really wanted to talk about. And it's something that I feel like a lot of us who lived through the 70s, 80s, 90s, it really resonates with us in a way that's very different than I think some of the Gen Z people are conducting themselves now.
It's just below Gen X, but I think there's a lot of crossover between Gen X and like Xennials at that point. The thing that we talked about before that I found the most connection with is actually Night Country, even though it's very different. But there's a couple of different themes that kind of connect there. You know, one of them is some of the atmosphere since the past when they're trapped on the mountainside. It's that kind of upper Canadian, and it's got that kind of, like you said, that sort of shamanic feel to things. And so it might be strange to point out that sound design was a huge part of this. And so you hear a lot of it's very similar to the stuff in Night Country with the Inupiaq, breath singing. That so there's that kind of like, strange ghostliness to it. But also just thematically in Night Country, we don't. It's like deep in the background, and we don't really see it coming to the fore until the end of the show. But there's that sense of the women who have their own way of dealing with things, and especially when it comes to protecting against men. and they are this, this very strong, powerful circle of mostly older women, but some younger women. There's elders, but in Yellowjackets, it's like what happens when that goes wrong, and that's where it's a lot less maturity and emotional development, and so the whole premise of the show at the beginning is meant to be a female Lord of the Flies, Lady of the Flies, if you will. That was sort of like the pitch, right? That what would happen if it's that situation, but with young women.
Definitely. I mean, I see why they build it as a Lady of the Flies per se. I mean, anyone who's been a young lady or raised a young lady, as we both have, uh, that there's this kind of, well, you had to deal with those evil females. There's a lot of evil females that pick on people that are not them, right? Like they're not popular, or they're not. It's almost the feeling of like Mean Girls or Heathers or something like that. It has that vibe to it, because I think there's a way in which anyone who's been around young girls in that stage, that they're extra vicious. They're way more vicious than the boys. The boys get feral in almost external type of way, and I'm not trying to bring this down to biology, but it's like they get more physical sometimes, whereas there's this mind fuck, I can say fuck because it's our show, that girls will try to do to each other, that's really really messed up. Like it's really intense and soul crushing, and really makes you doubt so much of who you are and what you thought was true. Once they don't have the normal conventions, once they don't have adult supervision, once they don't have food, all of those things, it just degenerates really, really quickly. And I think that's one of the things that I thought was fascinating about it. But it speaks to Night Country for me, but it also speaks to, we just did our David Lynch tribute, but it speaks to me in the same way that some of those Twin Peaks scenes do. Again, in this kind of Pacific Northwest, like what lives out in the wilderness, what lives out in the woods. Is it good? Is it bad? Do we need to feed it? Do we need to understand it? Do we need to befriend it? What will happen? And I think that's a really powerful theme. And I think it's something that is why I wanted to choose it for this show, because I think that this is something that a lot of witches, pagans, occult people struggle with, their relationship to nature, no matter how close or how far removed to it they are.
Yeah, and it's funny because now that you said that, I'm actually want to make another connection to another property. Because I was thinking with Agatha all along, it's all about finding your coven, right? And even when that begins from somewhat nefarious origins, but yeah, that whole thing of like, who are you safe with amongst your sisters, and who's a threat? And it seems like the way that the direction the show is going is that it ultimately like they're kind of out for themselves, but we'll kind of see how that goes. But in the past, I've written about occultism as this way of codifying certain kinds of human behavior. That desire to initiate, that desire to ritualize, that desire to sort of codify hierarchy or codify in-group out-group politics and stuff like that. And that's very much what the show is about. And what I found interesting in the early flashbacks, you see the soccer team functioning as they do in the school and on the field, and their pecking order. You see all in the early part of the first season, you see that sense of who has the power and who doesn't very early on, and you get to see, oh, this is that thematic foundation that they're laying. And it's sort of ironic that the young girl who's the leader on the field winds up being the one that doesn't really make it, literally, in the wilderness, because she can't adapt to this new environment. She's the leader on the field and in the school, but put in this situation, she has nothing to contribute, and she ultimately succumbs.
I mean, I think that's interesting. You're saying how people make meaning and things like that. Because part of what I was thinking about with it is this sort of, yes, there's the shamanism, but then we've got this Lottie character, right? So she's, mentally challenged, ill, whatever you want to call it, on psych meds, that kind of situation. No Sade, we all got to do what we got to do. But as soon as she goes without these psych meds, these visions start increasing, and how do we make meaning of these visions? And this is something I've been writing about a lot lately, this kind of unverified personal gnosis, right? Where do we draw the line? If somebody sees something or believes something, who are the people that we follow and say, oh, okay, this person really is seeing something or touching goddess or whatever? And who are the people that we decide, oh no, this person is dangerous or leading us into a really difficult territory and maybe we shouldn't follow them, so for everyone that's a quote unquote savior, there's, a bunch that are quote unquote cult leaders that are sort of leading people into the valley of destruction.
That's another Night Country connection, is that discussion about the line between madness and vision. That's a big part of the show, and also that notion of who's a valuable religious leader, spiritual leader, and who's just nuts. I mean, that's the history of occultism right there. But yeah,
I think that when we look at something like Night Country and those elders, there's a shamanic tradition that those people follow. There's a cultural context for that, and it follows those lines. Whereas when you end up in this scenario with a bunch of feral girls, it doesn't have that kind of cultural checks and balances.
there's a main thing in the show too, where is there a supernatural element happening, or is it all just in their heads? And that goes along with the Thaisa character too. Is she actually seeing the man with no eyes, or is this part of her mental illness? But yeah, there's definitely that question of is there a supernatural element? Is who left those symbols in the woods? But let's back up a little bit. The show started in 2021. It was created by actually a husband and wife team, Ashley Lyle and Bart Nickerson, and they're also the showrunners along with some other folks. And they were developing this as that Lord of the Flies thing. But we talked about how even Lord of the Flies itself recently has been sort of revised from for lack of a better term, a feminist perspective. That assumption that Lord of the Flies is really about what happens when you take away society, you take away rules and all that stuff. The critique has basically been that no, that's not what's actually at our natural core. That's what happens when young privileged rich white boys are put in a situation where they think society is a certain way because that's how they were raised, and so they reproduce that in the wild. And so that nature versus nurture argument has kind of been reframed in a way that I think people are looking at Lord of the Flies in the 21st century very differently. And I think that Yellowjacket starts with that premise, but I think that's just really basic, and it goes way beyond that. But yeah, that was their pitch, and they were trying to get it to HBO, and I guess it was too much like Euphoria, so HBO turned it away, and so it wound up on Showtime. Um, and yeah, and so what's great about it, said the earlier part is set in '96, and most of the older women in modern day were kind of '90s icons, right? So you got Christina Ricci. We all grew up with, or well, people of that generation anyway, we're a little bit older, grew up with Christina Ricci as Wednesday Addams, but then also seeing her kind of become this indie darling in later '90s movies. And then you've got Juliette Lewis, which of course, I mean, Natural Born Killers, that kind of that '90s sort of indie darling there. And then Melanie Linsky, though most American audiences know her from, I don't know, Two and a Half Men or crap like that, but I remember her from Heavenly Creatures, the Peter Jackson New Zealand based thing where her and Kate Winslet were teenage serial killers. So again, there's that teenage thing and the violence of that. So there's and then later on Lauren Ambrose, who's not so much, well, I guess late '90s, 6 Feet Under
6 feet
started,
under.
early 2000s. But yeah, so most of the older actors are these kind of '90s icons, and I think they're matched really well with their younger actress counterparts, and especially like Sophie Thatcher and Juliette Lewis that have a really interesting match, even though they don't look anything alike. Just vibe wise, they're so and they were cast like separately. They were just put together like that, and it works out really well. But Christina Ricci's character is very. I mean, I don't know. Is it kind of oversimplifying to say she's psycho? I mean, she's definitely sociopathic and narcissistic. And then she finds her perfect match with Elijah Wood in season two.
So
Um,
good. That is the best screen pairing I have seen in
oh yeah,
ages. They are perfect for each other.
for sure.
They're
But yeah,
both creepy and, you know.
the way that the show is structured, the very first thing you see in the show is this. Maybe I don't know if it's an end point, but it's a much later part that we haven't even caught up to yet, where they are in this kind of tribal setting with the horns and the veils, and they are doing a hunt ritual. And the big mystery is who is the pit girl, the girl that falls into the pit, who they ultimately eat, because she's wearing the necklace that Jackie's worn the first season, but we know pretty early on that Jackie doesn't make it. So who is the person with the necklace? And the necklace then becomes this sort of, as you see, becomes this sort of like ritual implement that marks the sacrifice. And I found that fascinating. That like, oh, that's how they're going to lead us around with this is using this implement. Um, so
Yeah,
yeah,
it's very emblematic. And then the playing cards too, when they decide whose turn it is to become the prey in the wild hunt. They pick cards, whoever gets the Queen of Hearts, right? Again, very iconic situation. So we're adding this sort of cartomancy element to it, right? And that carries out throughout their life. We even see them in the second season using that almost as a divinatory tool to decide who gets to be the sacrifice.
and of course the queen ties into the whole theme of the hive and Yellowjackets, and who's the queen bee, and the visions about the queen dying and all that kind of stuff. So if you haven't seen the show, I mean, we've spoiled a few things, but if you haven't seen the show, there it does jump back and forth between that time in the wilderness and modern time, and of course there's flashbacks to before they're in the wilderness, so it jumps around in time a lot. But yeah, there is that question of like, there's even a point when me as a viewer, I question: is this real? Did they actually survive the plane crash at all? Is this just weird? This weird afterlife thing? Because because Lost did that, so it's like, are they actually alive, or are they still in the woods? Maybe there's a lot of times they're tripping on mushrooms, or
And they have the whole doom's coming thing where they're eating mushrooms. So is this just sort of a mushroom induced vision? What's happening?
yeah. So there's definitely questions about like what's. I mean, we're not hit over the head with it, but there's a couple of times where we're like, huh, are we seeing what we're seeing? I think we get to the point where we begin to see what happens when, especially with people that age, young women are away from society. There is that tendency to, when you're in survival mode, there's that tendency to want to ritualize, to make things important. And there's that, it kind of takes me back to kind of when I used to read a lot of pop anthropology, like Ronald Grimes stuff about ritual theory and all that kind of thing, that we are homo ritualists or whatever, that as human beings we have this tendency to to ritualize and to structure things based on the vaguest of beliefs. And that's what we see happen when they're in the woods, especially when they get to the point where they're not eating and trying to do everything they can to survive through just regular hunting, and then ultimately through cannibalism. But it's that mushroom trip you mentioned, where it's like, oh, suddenly they're maenads, right? Suddenly they
Yeah.
start, they start going after the one guy, Travis, and then and you begin to see that they're in the mushroom vision. They start to have the pointy teeth, and it's like suddenly, oh yeah, they're dressed up in almost like classical Greek outfits, and it's like, oh yeah, they're
Mm-hmm.
they're totally, they're totally referencing Dionysus and the maenads there, and Orpheus, of course. As soon as I saw that, I was like, yeah, I see what they did there.
No, it's fascinating. I'm curious to see where they go with it. There's so much in here. I'm hoping, like you are, that it doesn't sort of tank and end up not making sense the way Lost did. I think, or we never know, right? Like Twin Peaks. I mean, who knows? We may never know.
Going back to what you were saying about what makes a spiritual leader, and what I found fascinating about the Lottie character is that when we see the young Lottie, in contrast with the older Lottie that we don't see till season two, who very much is, she's running the retreat center. She has that facade, at least, of confident spiritual leadership, and that she knows what's best, and that people are following her, and there's sort of no question. And it's not until a little bit later that we start to see the cracks and all that. But the younger Lottie, it's almost like the opposite. There are like these moments of confidence, but it seems like throughout that she doesn't really know what's going on, and she just has these kind of beliefs, and it's really everybody else who have put this position upon her. And I found that really true to life in terms of how certain spiritual leaders function. I mean, I've seen this happen in the groups that I've been a part of, where someone who just happens to have a certain kind of charisma or a certain kind of vision or focus or dedication, everybody else in the group sees that, and they want to confer power on this person, and the person doesn't necessarily want that power, but they're kind of backed into a corner. This really came into play, I think, towards the end of season two in the flashbacks, where Misty is like, she's when she's alone with Lottie, she says, "You started this. You've got to pick up on the basically." When she's trying to convince Lottie that they have to eat a certain character, um, that because Lottie actually doesn't want that, and Misty's like, no, you've got to do this. And so Misty's that is that in that role is the very sort of zealous underling who really kind of creates that situation by putting that leader into power. So I found that dynamic very nuanced and interesting, and true to life when it comes to spiritual leadership. I don't know how you
I
felt about
think that, I mean, I feel like Misty's character, not that she's overweight, and I apologize for using the acronym, but you've got this kind of Duff character, right? Like the dumb, ugly, fat friend. Misty's the one who's always sort of like steering them into, the danger and like, what, and things like that. But she's never going to be that number one, but she's the one who's always standing there egging that person on. And
it.
I do think it was also interesting that Lottie might not know that she's pretty at the beginning. And I thought that was just because she was hepped up on psych meds and she's coming off them. That's where I sort the younger Lottie being somebody who was not in control. Whereas once she gets older, they even mentioned that she had the money. You don't end up running one of those new age airy fairy retreats in the woods if you don't have, finances and backing or somewhat. So I see her as having that kind of privilege, and that's why she's moving into this, coupled with the visions, coupled with somebody like Misty who's going to shove her to the front so she can continue to do what she wants in the background.
Right. It's clear from the flashbacks that Lottie comes from a rich family, and that they are able to take care of her in that way. So yeah, it is that combination that when someone is raised in that way, that they do feel like what they have to say matters. But again, it's also what the rest of the girls put on her, and
Right.
it's almost chilling at a certain point where they're like, we've got to eat somebody, but it can't be Lottie. Like
Yes.
they
Yes.
acknowledge her importance, that they can't survive without her leadership, even though it's and like Natalie's like, this is ridiculous. I'm the one who actually hunts the food and like keeps you guys alive, so why is she the important one? But then it's when Natalie becomes the new queen at the end, that's when the coach is like, I'm out. Because he's like, he thought that Natalie would be an ally, and to see the craziness for what it is, And then as soon as he sees that she's succumbing to that groupthink, he's like, nope, I'm done.
Like they're chasing Natalie into the thing and they're out on the ice. Like Misty comes over. I rewatched it yesterday. Misty comes
Yeah,
over and is like, no, let him die. Otherwise it's
right.
going to be you, you know? So there's always Misty in this crucial
Yeah,
part, like pivoting things so that
she's the
she's
instigator.
scripting the narrative.
Yeah,
It's
she's
beautiful.
absolutely the instigator. I mean, from the very beginning, and then of course, we see that in the first episode or two that she smashes the communicator, the black box from the plane, so they won't be rescued because she realizes, oh, I'm valued and important here, and I want to hold on to that, like that stereotype that teen archetype would do, right? But yeah, she's definitely the driving factor in so much of this. But it's fascinating to see the other girls fall in line, especially the Van character, who seems like she's in some ways like over and independent. She's resentful at first because they don't try to rescue her, but she still survives. But yet she falls into it and is like, okay, I'm going to be part of this, and this is how I'm going to survive, and I'm going to put all my faith in what's happening and be a believer. And so yeah, there's that. There's clearly, um, I think, for our occult purposes, there's the way that these dynamics work, in which there is a hidden, unknown factor that both of us through our practice have experienced. I think, and especially when you've got that more sort of, again, the wilderness as an entity, when you don't have a specific thing, like, who are we sacrificing to, what is it, is it is it a goddess, is it a some kind of chthonic underworld entity, what does that symbol mean, who made that symbol, and how did that start? There's a lot of mysteries there, but like clearly we see early on that symbol existed in that woods where they just happened to land. Why did the plane crash? We don't even know at the end of season 2 why the plane crashed, other than like bad weather. Like, it just seems a little, we don't know why the plane explodes that the Christian girl tries to take up.
Yeah, I was going to talk about that because I think that the Christian girl, we have to get rid of her right away, right? Like, because we're
Yeah,
going over literally into the wilderness, into this kind of wild, pagan, alternative, shamanistic lifestyle. So she's so rigid and she's so good that she has to both simultaneously try and save them and also be killed in the trying to save them. We had to get rid of her. So plot
yeah,
wise, I think there was nothing else they could have done. We have to take her out and show that your Christ is not good here.
right,
Like, Christ has
yeah.
left the building and blown up in front of our eyes.
But ironically, it's that character that baptizes Lottie that sort of wakes her up in something, that she begins to see visions based on this experience of baptism in the lake. So there, so that I'm blanking on the Christian girl's name, but she's a spiritual catalyst. But once she's done her job, yeah, she's got to go.
She's out.
It's funny that it's not necessarily the wilderness that takes her. It's she has to go be literally above it all to then be taken out of the equation. So yeah, I
Well,
mean,
that's kind of why it reminds me of Lost and Twin Peaks. You know what I mean? It's not just that time is not our normal understanding of it, it's that space as well is not our normal understanding of it. So it's almost reminds me of Lost, where like you can't go past this area or you can't go into this, you're going to end up in the Black Lodge if you step into this fairy circle, right? Like, so there's like her having the plane and trying to sort of exit this bubble that they're in. It's like automatically that she has to be taken out. And even with that character, the assistant coach character, he stays on the fringes, but he's always on the fringe of where they are, even though it's this like vast, gigantic wilderness. He's always in this liminal space, sort of like popping his head in and out, creating drama, creating whatever is happening with him.
there's definitely some interesting things in the present day in which they're all dealing with this super fucked up past trauma. It's all affected them in different ways, and they've all coped in different ways. But very clearly, some are adapting better than others. But that's the sort of question of like, where is this all going to lead? I mean, they literally are getting away with murder, but also where does this leave them? And, I'm not going to spoil it, but yeah, some characters don't really make it out very well. So yeah, especially when we're talking about Lottie, the adult Lottie, and how she has to somehow come to terms with what she went through, but yet she's kind of pulling other people into this vision. Like when we see her at the retreat center, when Natalie shows up there, they're witnessing a ritual in which someone is, it's clearly like some kind of a shamanic initiation type of thing where they're burying someone alive, but they've got the animal masks and they've got all that stuff going on, so that clearly like had this psychological impact on Lottie, and she carried that over into her adult practice. I think we're asked to consider what that will do to a person, and how that kind of ritualization in that context can then be carried over into civilization, right? Um,
I love that in contrast with the Van character, right? Because what we see is Van's the one that is not in contact with the other women who were there. They're running a video store, which at that point is already on the way out. They have cancer, right? Like, so they're sick on top of it. So there's a way in which this kind of insular, do it by myself kind of drive that Van had the whole time is working against her. She's probably one of the characters that we see in adulthood that's some of the worst off, right? Like they're not married, they're not running for, senator or mayor or whatever.
the other thing about Van is that she's the storyteller. It kind of makes sense that she runs a video store, because in the woods she's called upon to be the storyteller around the campfire, where she tells the stories of popular movies like Princess Bride and While You Were Sleeping. She tells that story as a romantic thing. So yeah, Van's the one that keeps them together through story. So it makes sense that she's the one that has the nostalgic video store. So yeah, there's a lot of really just interesting nuances to the characters, and the fact that Misty, for instance, is like a true crime enthusiast, and she literally knows how to get rid of the bodies because
Who
she's
works in
also
a
a police
nursing
officer.
home.
Yeah.
I think that's great because we've got her medical knowledge while she's there in the woods, but now she's in this weird niche kind of thing in the nursing home where it doesn't matter what she does to these patients. She's like carrying out her, sadomasochistic desires on these poor elderly people. It's like, it's
Petite
perfect.
Misty even talks about how young Kevorkian is sexy. So she says this fantasy about that again. It's power. Really, but it's also
Mm-hmm.
but it's a certain kind of power. But yeah, very very clearly, the fact that she's a true crime enthusiast and knows how to work things, how to get away with things, and then of course, Elijah Wood's character is the next level.
All right. So I guess keep watching. Thank you for watching this. Please support our Patreon and like and share. This is a labor of love. We don't really even make enough to pay for this show. So please, if you like us, do what you can.
So yeah, that's it for episode 12 of season 3. We're gonna do a few more before we wrap up the season. And thanks for joining us. And catch us next time on Pop Culture with Lilith Dorsey and Jason Winslade. See you next time.
Bye. Queen Wave.
Queen Wave.